This chapter is on how we analyze qualitative data. Chapter 11. As you may recall from the previous chapter, the data collection in qualitative studies are continually evolving, and what we're trying to do is to collect data until the data is fully saturated. So qualitative analysis may involve understanding that more data needs to be collected. It's a largely inductive process. It's flexible and it's open-ended, very unlike our quantitative data analysis, where there was a rigid process that we had to adhere to. With qualitative analysis, we have more leniency to follow the direction where the data leads us, which is quite the opposite of our quantitative analysis. The first thing that you want to do is to convert the data into a form that you can work with. Every qualitative researcher takes a different perspective. Some qualitative researchers will simply rely on the qualitative data. So therefore, if they're collecting interview data, they will look for patterns and themes of the various interviews that they have given. And with that information then, make a decision as to what general trend did they see across all of them. They will then take quotes from each of the interviews to provide evidence to support the themes that they indicated emerged. Now, other qualitative researchers prefer to quantify their data. The way in which they do that are to organize the data superficially to start and then identify categories and codes. So they would identify, okay, here are the categories, so whether or not you're converting it to quantitative. Here are the categories that emerged. Here are the themes, essentially. And some qualitative researchers will take it a step further and code it. So giving numbers, maybe higher numbers if it represents more of that theme or category, and lower numbers if it doesn't represent as much of that theme or category. And then they can quantify it and then work with those numbers. Many qualitative researchers will simply rely on that verbal qualitative data. And they want to divide the data in a way that is meaningful and begin to interpret it. So again, they will define at this point, after they've collected the data, it's been saturated, they identify the themes that emerged. Whether or not they quantified those codes, they can label those codes and to say, okay, here's the group that's high autonomy, here's the group that's low autonomy. They may say, what kinds of things am I using to define autonomy? The extent to which they're making their own decisions, the extent to which they feel like they have control over their work environment. And so then with those, we can either code them simply with a qualitative category and say high and low, or we can say on a scale of 1 to 10, how high was this individual's autonomy? And they can begin to rate it. Either way, we want at least two coders to evaluate it, to have what we call inter-rater reliability. And we'd like inter-rater reliability between the coders to establish that not only am I seeing these themes emerge, but I have another person who is also seeing those same themes emerge. And the extent to which we can do so at least 90% of the time with 90% agreement, then we can establish that we have high inter-rater reliability. Pretty much the lowest cutoff is 80% agreement, but always shooting for 90% or higher, especially in qualitative research, in order to be able to establish and say that, yes, in fact, these are the themes that emerged. So you have two people independently code the data, so not together, and then compare their codings. And hopefully, again, they reach that 90% agreement between the two coders. Okay, they also want to identify patterns and relationships, and the hope is always to do so with various forms of data. And this is what we call triangulating the data. They want to make sure that we're able to triangulate the data from various sources. So if we're looking at autonomy, teacher autonomy, we might also want to ask students some questions, administrators, other staff at the school, in order to be able to triangulate the findings from our teachers. We always look for outliers, and so these are not quantitative outliers, but these are people whose responses really fall outside of the range of categories that we've identified as a pattern across most of our participants. Are there any exceptions to the rule? For quantitative data in our previous chapters, those outliers are really problematic, and we actually find ways to eliminate them and exclude them from further analysis because they really don't fit within the patterns of the rest of the sample. With qualitative data, however, these outliers become extremely, extremely important and a really good source of information. If someone does not fall within the range of what we would expect, how can we explain that? Why didn't they fall within the range? And this is where qualitative research really has an opportunity to then explain why would someone not follow or fit within those patterns that we identified for the rest of the group. We can explain that and again provide evidence with quotes and examples. And then we want to think about how the data helps to answer our research question. So organizing those themes in a meaningful manner. Your textbook discusses that this data analysis, this qualitative data, is somewhat of a spiral that we go through. Beginning with the raw data in this case being verbal data or observational data, depending on the type of qualitative design that you had. And you are creating, first step is taking that raw data and organizing it. So how will you organize it, file it, put it in a computer database? And then the next thing is just eyeball the data, right? So look through it, peruse the data, see if you can get an overall sense of what the data is showing. What patterns are beginning to emerge in your mind as you're reading through all of this data? Jotting down preliminary interpretations, but not creating the categories just yet. The next step, after you've at least gone through the data once, because you're going to want to go through the data several times before really identifying those themes and patterns and categories, is we start this process of what's called classification, grouping the data into categories or themes and finding meaningful connections. And then finally, this is where we really get to the analysis, which is synthesis, offering hypotheses or propositions, constructing tables, diagrams, hierarchies, flowcharts, anything that will help explain what the data has been indicating. And then we take that synthesis and put it in a manner with evidence from quotes and examples for our final report. Again, with qualitative data, we always need to remember that the researcher is the primary instrument for the data analysis. So as a researcher, you want to always strive for balance and fairness and completeness, not missing any parts, not excluding anything that's important. Carefully document your analysis and procedures and be upfront about your personal biases. As a consumer of research, you're looking for these same components. So you want to make sure, did they provide enough information about themselves so that we can make a judgment as to whether or not they allowed themselves to influence the results. And whether we're conducting qualitative research or reading qualitative research, these are the criteria that we want to make sure to check. And that's it for this chapter.